Wevelgem Airfield, Belgium, April 17, 1943. Hauptmann Victor Bauer stood on the flight line of Jagdgeschwader 26, studying the reconnaissance photographs spread across the wing of his Focke-Wulf 190. The images showed a new American fighter, captured in grainy detail over the airfields of southern England, a machine so grotesquely proportioned that the pilots gathered around him had stopped analyzing and started laughing. "It looks pregnant," observed Lieutenant Gerhard Vogt, tracing the fighter's enormous fuselage with his finger. "What are they feeding it over there?" Oberfeldwebel Adolf Gluntz, already an ace with 41 victories, leaned in for a closer look. "The engine cowling alone is larger than our entire aircraft. How does it even leave the ground?" Bauer permitted himself a thin smile. He had been fighting the Americans since they arrived over Europe, had studied their P-38 Lightnings and P-39 era Cobras, and found them wanting. This new machine, the intelligence summary identified it as the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, appeared to be a masterwork of American excess. Everything about it was oversized, overbuilt, overwrought. The fuselage was nearly 5 meters in circumference. The engine, a Pratt & Whitney R2800, displaced 2,800 cubic inches, more than twice the displacement of the BMW 801 that powered his own FW190. "They have built a flying barrel," Bauer concluded, tapping the photograph. "Look at the wing loading. The turn radius will be catastrophic. And this weight," he consulted the intelligence estimate, "nearly 7 tons fully loaded. 7 tons. Our 190 weighs half that." He straightened, addressing his pilots with the confidence of a man who had killed 53 enemies and fully intended to kill 53 more. "The Americans have confused size with strength. When these barrels waddle into our airspace, we will teach them the difference between a fighter aircraft and a flying truck." The laughter continued through dinner that evening. Someone had drawn a cartoon on the mess hall chalkboard. A P-47 so fat it required 2 runways to take off, its pilot visible through the canopy as a tiny stick figure dwarfed by the machine around him. Beneath the drawing, a caption read, "Der Amerikaner Dicke," the American fatty. Bauer approved the joke. Humor was good for morale, and his men needed to understand that the aircraft massing across the channel were nothing to fear. The Americans could build all the flying trucks they wanted. The Luftwaffe would destroy them the same way they had destroyed everything else, with speed, with precision, with pilots who understood that air combat was not won by the largest machine, but by the most skilled hand on the stick. He recorded his assessment in his diary that night, in handwriting so precise it might have been typeset. The new American fighter represents a fundamental misunderstanding of aerial combat. The P-47 is too heavy to climb, too fat to turn, too large to evade. Its only advantage is the 8 machine guns the intelligence reports describe. But machine guns are useless if you cannot bring them to bear. I predict significant American losses when this aircraft enters combat. The pilots flying it will discover that war is not won by tonnage. What Victor Bauer did not know, what none of the laughing pilots of JG-26 could have conceived that spring evening in Belgium, was that the flying barrel would prove nearly impossible to shoot down. He did not know that the 8.50 caliber machine guns he dismissed would carry enough concentrated firepower to saw a Focke-Wulf in half in less than 2 seconds. He did not know that the enormous engine he mocked would drag the P-47 to speeds no German fighter could match in a dive, that the grotesque fuselage would absorb punishment that would vaporize a Messerschmitt, that the weight he calculated as fatal would become the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back over Germany. He did not know that within 18 months, his unit would be bled white by the aircraft he called Dicke, that JG-26 would lose more pilots to P-47s than to any other American fighter, that the laughter in the mess hall would curdle into something closer to dread. He did not know that the joke would kill him. But over the burning cities of the Reich, over the shattered airfields of France, over the killing ground that the American pilots would call the Big League, he would learn. They all would. To understand why German pilots dismissed the P-47 with such casual contempt, one must first understand what 4 years of aerial warfare had taught them about what made a fighter lethal, and why, By every metric the Luftwaffe valued, the Thunderbolt appeared to be a flying contradiction. German fighter doctrine had been forged in the skies over Spain, Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. It was not theoretical. It was written in the blood of enemies who had made the mistakes the Germans now catalogued with clinical precision. And the central lesson, repeated in every training manual and tactical briefing, was this: in aerial combat, the lighter aircraft wins. Weight was death. Weight meant sluggish acceleration. Weight meant poor climb rate. Weight meant wide turn radius. Weight meant that when an enemy appeared on your tail, you could not escape. The mathematics were irrefutable, grounded in the physics that governed every aircraft that had ever flown. Thrust-to-weight ratio determined climb, wing loading determined turn performance, and both favored the machine that carried less mass into the sky. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's original thoroughbred, weighed 2,700 kilograms fully loaded. The Focke-Wulf 190, its more modern stablemate, came in at 3,900 kilograms. Both aircraft had been designed by engineers who understood that every kilogram mattered, that armor was a luxury, that the best protection was not to be hit in the first place. They were lean, fast, lethal, surgical instruments built for pilots who expected to kill before their enemies could react. The P-47 Thunderbolt weighed 6,400 kilograms, nearly 7 tons. General Major Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, reviewed the intelligence assessments on American aircraft in early 1943 and delivered his verdict to Reichsmarschall Göring in a memorandum that would later be captured by Allied forces. The Americans continue to demonstrate a preference for size over agility. Their P-38 is fast but unmaneuverable. Their P-39 is adequately armed but underpowered. Now comes the P-47, which appears to combine the worst characteristics of both: excessive weight, excessive size, excessive complexity. Our pilots report that American fighters cannot compete with the Bf 109 or FW 190 in any maneuvering engagement. The P-47, by every technical assessment, will be even less competitive. I do not anticipate this aircraft changing the balance of air superiority over the Reich. The confidence was grounded in recent experience. American fighters had been dying over Europe since August 1942, when the first P-38 Lightnings arrived to escort heavy bombers against targets in occupied France. The Luftwaffe had studied them, fought them, and learned to kill them with systematic efficiency. The P-38, with its distinctive twin-boom design, was fast in level flight, but lost energy catastrophically in hard maneuvering. German pilots learned to bait Lightnings into turning engagements, then cut inside their radius and destroy them. The P-39-era Cobra, relegated mostly to the Eastern Front, was dismissed as a flying coffin. Underpowered, poorly armored, with an alarming tendency to enter unrecoverable spins. American pilots flying these machines died at exchange rates that validated everything German doctrine proclaimed. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who commanded fighter units in both the Mediterranean and Western theaters, explained the tactical reality to newly arrived pilots in the spring of 1943. The American is brave but predictable. He has been trained to maintain formation, to protect his bombers, to fight defensively. He does not hunt, he guards. When we attack, he reacts. This is fatal. In air combat, the pilot who reacts is already losing. Our task is to strike fast, from above, with the sun behind us. One pass, one kill, then away before they can respond. Against their current fighters, this tactic is nearly unbeatable. The statistics supported Steinhoff's assessment. In the first 4 months of 1943, American fighter losses over Europe exceeded 150 aircraft, against fewer than 40 Luftwaffe fighters confirmed destroyed in air-to-air combat. The exchange rate approached 4-1 in Germany's favor. Some units reported even more lopsided results. JG-26, Bauer's own unit, claimed 23 American fighters destroyed between January and April 1943 while losing only 4 of their own to enemy aircraft. These were not propaganda figures. They were operational realities confirmed by both sides. The American 8th Air Force was bleeding, and its commanders knew it. General Ira Eaker, commanding the bomber offensive from England, wrote in a private letter to General Henry Arnold in March 1943, "Our fighter escorts are insufficient in number and and outmatched in capability. The German pilots are more experienced, their aircraft more maneuverable, their tactics more aggressive. Until we can provide escorts capable of meeting the Luftwaffe on equal terms, we must expect continued heavy losses. Into this environment came the P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft that violated every principle German doctrine held sacred. It was not light. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. It was not agile. Its turn radius at combat speeds exceeded that of any German fighter by a significant margin. It was not simple. Its turbo-supercharged engine required maintenance procedures that made German ground crews shake their heads in disbelief. What it was, though German intelligence had not yet grasped the implications, was something entirely new. A fighter designed not to outmaneuver the enemy, but to refuse engagement on the enemy's terms entirely. A fighter that would dictate the rules of combat rather than accept them. A fighter built on principles so alien to European air warfare that the men who would face it literally could not imagine how it was supposed to be flown. The Germans looked at the P-47 and saw everything a fighter should not be. They did not see what it actually was, a weapon designed to make everything they knew about air combat irrelevant. The aircraft that would humble the Luftwaffe was born in a Long Island factory from the mind of a Georgian immigrant who had never fired a shot in combat, but understood with the clarity of a mathematician that the future of air warfare belonged to whoever could fly highest and fastest and stay there longest. Alexander Kartveli had fled the Russian Revolution in 1920, arrived in America with an engineering degree and nothing else, and spent 2 decades designing aircraft that most of his peers considered dangerously unconventional. By 1940, he was chief designer at Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, and he had become obsessed with a single problem: how to build a fighter that could escort American bombers to Berlin and back. The problem was not trivial. Berlin lay 600 miles from the nearest English airfield. A round trip, accounting for combat maneuvering and fuel reserves, required a fighter with a range exceeding 1,500 miles, nearly 3 times what any existing American fighter could achieve. Worse, the bombers would fly at 25,000 feet or higher to avoid German flak. A fighter operating at that altitude needed a supercharged engine capable of producing full power in air so thin that unsupercharged engines lost half their output. Range and altitude. Every American fighter designer was wrestling with the same constraints. Most approached the problem conventionally. Start with the lightest possible airframe. Add the most efficient engine available. Optimize for fuel economy. The results were adequate aircraft, adequate range, adequate performance, adequate in every way that translated to not good enough. Kartveli approached the problem differently. He started not with the airframe, but with the engine, specifically the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the most powerful radial engine in American production. The R2800 produced 2,000 horsepower at sea level, enough raw thrust to drag almost anything into the sky. But raw power was useless at altitude without a supercharger, and conventional superchargers were belt-driven parasites that consumed 300 horsepower just to operate. Kartveli's solution was elegant and audacious, a turbo supercharger system that used exhaust gases to spin a turbine, which compressed intake air, which fed the engine, which produced more exhaust, which spun the turbine faster. The system was self-reinforcing, growing more efficient as altitude increased. At 30,000 feet, where German fighters gasped for air and conventional engines wheezed at half power, the turbo-supercharged R2800 would produce nearly its full rated output. There was a cost. The turbocharger required an elaborate system of ducts, intercoolers, and wastegates that added hundreds of pounds to the airframe. The ducting alone ran the entire length of the fuselage, from the engine cowling to the turbocharger mounted in the rear fuselage, hence the P-47's distinctive pregnant profile that German pilots found so amusing. More weight meant larger wings to generate lift. Larger wings meant more structural weight, and the spiral continued until the finished aircraft tipped the scales at nearly 7 tons. I was told repeatedly that I was building an unacceptable aircraft, Kartveli later recalled in a 1956 interview with Aviation Week. The Army wanted a fighter that weighed 8,000 pounds. I gave them one that weighed 14,000. They said it was too heavy to dogfight. I said it wasn't designed to dogfight. They asked what it was designed for. I told them to fly higher, faster, and farther than anything the Germans have, and to carry enough guns to destroy anything it catches. The armament was the final piece of Kartveli's philosophy. European fighters typically carried 2 or 4 guns, a compromise between firepower and weight. Kartveli installed 8 M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns in the P-47's wings, 4 per side, fed by ammunition belts holding 425 rounds per gun. The combined weight of guns and ammunition exceeded 1,200 pounds, a burden that would have crippled a conventional fighter. But the P-47 was not a conventional fighter, and the firepower was not excessive, it was calculated. Kartveli understood that the P-47 would not win turning fights. It would win by diving on enemies from above, making a single firing pass, and using its speed to escape before the enemy could react. A pilot executing this tactic would have perhaps 2 seconds to destroy his target. In 2 seconds, 8.50 caliber machine guns firing at 800 rounds per minute would put 213 rounds into a cone of airspace roughly the size of a telephone booth. Captain Cass Hauf, a test pilot who evaluated the P-47 at Wright Field in early 1942, described the armament in terms that would prove prophetic. The firepower is unlike anything I've experienced. One burst from all 8 guns sounds like a canvas tent being ripped apart. The recoil actually slows the aircraft noticeably. But the effect on the target, I watched gun camera footage of tests against mock-ups, and the results were more like demolition than gunnery. The concentrated fire doesn't punch holes, it disintegrates structures. The Army Air Forces accepted the P-47 with reservations. General Henry Arnold, commanding the AAF, approved production in 1942 while noting in his diary, "Republic's new fighter is an impressive machine but an unproven concept. Kartveli has built the largest single-engine fighter in history and claims it will outfight smaller, more agile opponents through speed and firepower alone. If he is wrong, we will have invested tremendous resources in an aircraft unsuited for combat. If he is right, he will have changed how air wars are fought." The first production P-47s rolled off Republic's assembly lines in March 1942. By January 1943, they were arriving in England, unpacked from shipping crates, and assembled by ground crews who struggled to believe that the enormous machines they were building were actually supposed to fly. The British, who had been fighting the Luftwaffe for 3 years, were skeptical. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory examined a P-47 at a demonstration in February 1943 and offered his assessment to American liaison officers. "It's certainly impressive in a brute force sort of way, but I don't see how it can possibly compete with the 109 or the 190 in a maneuvering fight. Your pilots will need to be very careful about when and how they engage." What Leigh-Mallory did not understand, what no one trained in European air combat doctrine could quite grasp, was that the P-47 would never engage in a maneuvering fight. Not because it couldn't, but because it didn't have to. Kartveli had not built a better dogfighter. He had built a machine that made dogfighting obsolete. The Luftwaffe was about to discover that the rules they had mastered no longer applied. But first, American pilots had to learn the rules themselves, and the learning cost lives. The 4th Fighter Group flew its first P-47 combat mission on April 15, 1943, escorting B-17 bombers against targets in France. The group was composed largely of former Eagle Squadron pilots, Americans who had volunteered to fly Spitfires with the RAF before the United States entered the war. They were experienced, aggressive, and convinced they knew how to fight German aircraft. They were wrong. Major Don Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, led 16 Thunderbolts toward the French coast that morning. They found the bombers under attack by FW-190s from JG-26, the same unit where Victor Bauer and his pilots had laughed at reconnaissance photographs just days earlier. What followed was a brutal introduction to the gap between theory and practice. The American pilots, trained on Spitfires that could turn with anything in the sky, instinctively pulled into the German fighters when attacked. It was a fatal error. The P-47's turn radius at combat speed exceeded the FW-190's by nearly 40%. Every American pilot who tried to match a German turn found himself on the outside of the circle, bleeding energy, falling behind, becoming a target instead of a threat. Lieutenant Dwayne Beeson, who would eventually become an ace, described the engagement in his combat diary. "We tried to dogfight them. God help us, we tried. Every time I pulled into a 190, he just turned inside me like I was standing still. I watched Miller go down. He was trying to reverse on a German's tail, and the wingman came around and cut him apart. The jug won't turn. It won't. And if you try to make it turn, you die." 3 P-47s were lost that day. The Luftwaffe lost none. German pilots returned to Wevelgem in high spirits. Oberfeldwebel Glunz, who had claimed one of the Thunderbolts, reported to the intelligence officer with something approaching glee. "The new American fighter is exactly what we predicted. Fat, slow in the turn, and flown by pilots who do not understand its limitations. The one I killed was trying to follow me through a vertical reversal. I simply waited for him to stall, then walked my guns across his cockpit. It was not a fight, it was an execution." Hauptmann Bauer added his own assessment to the unit's after-action report. "The P-47 confirms our initial evaluation. The aircraft cannot maneuver with our fighters, and its pilots have not yet learned to compensate for this deficiency. Recommend aggressive engagement tactics. Force the Americans into turning fights and destroy them at leisure. Current evidence suggests the P-47 will prove less dangerous than the P-38, which at least has speed to escape." Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated with grim consistency. American pilots, unfamiliar with their new aircraft and resistant to tactics that seemed cowardly, continued trying to dogfight. They continued dying. The 78th Fighter Group lost 7 pilots in its first month of operations. The 56th Fighter Group, equipped with P-47s fresh from the factory, lost 5 in its first 2 weeks. Exchange rates that had favored the Americans in early 1943, when P-38s could at least run from trouble, now swung decisively toward the Luftwaffe. In April and May 1943, P-47 units lost 31 aircraft confirmed destroyed. They claimed 18 German fighters in return, and post-war analysis suggested even that number was optimistic. The mockery intensified. German fighter pilots began calling the P-47 the Eisenschwein, Iron Pig, and the name spread through Luftwaffe units across the Western Front. Intelligence summaries distributed to German squadrons included tactical recommendations that bordered on contemptuous. The P-47 should be engaged aggressively at every opportunity. The aircraft's weight makes it vulnerable in all maneuvering flight. American pilots appear untrained in energy tactics and will consistently attempt horizontal maneuvers where German superiority is most pronounced. Destroy at will. Even the Americans' allies were losing faith. Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory, who had expressed reservations during the February demonstration, now pressed for P-47 units to be re-equipped with Spitfires. In a heated memorandum to 8th Air Force headquarters, he wrote, "The P-47 is unsuited for the air superiority mission as currently employed. Its losses are unsustainable, and its contribution to bomber protection negligible. I strongly recommend that American fighter groups transition to Spitfire 9s, which have proven capable of engaging German fighters on equal terms." Major General William Kepner, commanding 8th Fighter Command, faced a crisis. His new fighters were dying at rates that threatened to cripple the bomber offensive before it truly began. His pilots were demoralized, convinced they had been given an inferior aircraft and ordered to fight with one hand tied behind their backs. His British allies were openly suggesting that American aircraft design had failed. And then there were voices from within, pilots, who were beginning to understand what Kartveli had actually built. Lieutenant Colonel Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, had been studying combat reports with the intensity of a scientist examining experimental data. He saw the losses, but he also saw something else. The P-47s that survived were surviving damage that would have destroyed any other fighter. A P-47 from his unit had returned with 21 cannon holes in its fuselage and wings, 21 hits from 20mm rounds that would have disintegrated a Spitfire or a 109. The aircraft had been repaired in 2 days. Another had taken a burst through the engine cowling that destroyed 3 cylinders of the R2800. The remaining 15 cylinders had carried the pilot 200 miles back to England. The airplane won't turn. Zemke told his pilots in a briefing that would become legendary in 8th Air Force history. Stop trying to make it turn. But the airplane will do 2 things better than anything the Germans have. It will dive, and it will survive. So we're going to change how we fight. No more dogfighting. No more turning engagements. We dive. We shoot. We keep diving. If we miss, we don't come back around. We extend. We climb back up, and we dive again. The Germans can't follow us down because we'll out-accelerate them. They can't catch us afterward because we'll be going too fast to intercept. And if they hit us, he paused. This airplane can take hits that would kill anything else in the sky. It was a revolution in miniature, a complete rejection of everything fighter pilots had been taught since 1914. But Zemke understood what the laughing Germans did not. The P-47 was not a bad dogfighter. It was a machine designed to make dogfighting irrelevant. The pilots of the 56th were skeptical. The tactics felt wrong. Hit and run, refusing engagement, fleeing from fights instead of finishing them. It violated every instinct, every story of aces they had grown up admiring, every image of what a fighter pilot was supposed to be. But they were tired of dying, and Zemke was offering them a way to live. The transformation was about to begin. 30,000 feet over Düren, Germany, June 26, 1943. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson was going to die. He knew this with the certainty of a man who had already been killed, his aircraft shattered, his controls destroyed, his body burning with wounds he could not yet count. The only question was whether he would die in the next 10 seconds or the 10 seconds after that. It had started well. The 56th Fighter Group had been escorting B-17s to targets in the Ruhr, flying top cover at 30,000 feet, where the turbo-supercharged R2800 sang at full power, and the German fighters below looked like gnats. They had spotted FW-190s climbing to intercept, and Zemke had given the order: Wolfpack, punch tanks, and engage. Dive and extend. No turning fights. Johnson had rolled into his dive, selected a 190 that hadn't seen him coming, and pressed the trigger at 400 yards. The 8.50s roared. That sound, that impossible tearing canvas sound that shook the entire airframe, and the German fighter came apart in midair. The burst lasted less than 2 seconds. The Focke-Wulf's wing separated from the fuselage as if it had been sawed through. The fuselage tumbled. The pilot never got out. 1 pass. 1 kill, exactly as Zemke had promised. And then Johnson had pulled up to regain altitude, and that was when the 20mm cannon shell had come through his canopy. He never saw the FW-190 that hit him. He felt the impact, an explosion of glass and metal, and sudden, searing pain in his nose and forehead. And then his P-47 was falling, spinning, the sky and earth trading places in a blur of blue and brown. He fought the controls. They responded sluggishly, wrongly, like pulling on dead limbs. Something was broken. Many things were broken. He managed to level out at 18,000 feet. The P-47 was still flying. How was it still flying? But the instrument panel was a shattered ruin, the canopy was gone, and wind screamed through the cockpit at 300 miles per hour. He could feel blood running down his face, pooling in his oxygen mask. His left hand wouldn't close properly. There was a hole in his right thigh he didn't remember receiving. And then the FW-190 appeared alongside him, not attacking, just flying formation, close enough that Johnson could see the pilot's face through the German's canopy. Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of the Luftwaffe's fighter commander, had been the one who hit the American. Now he was examining his kill, watching it die, perhaps waiting to confirm the crash for his victory claim. He had seen the cannon shells strike. He had seen the canopy disintegrate. He had seen the American fighter fall. No aircraft could survive that damage. This was merely the death throes. Galland raised his hand in what might have been a salute. the old gesture of chivalry between fighter pilots, acknowledging a doomed enemy, and then pulled away to make his killing pass. What happened next would become legend in the 56th Fighter Group. Galland came around behind Johnson's crippled P-47 and opened fire. Johnson saw the tracers streaming past his cockpit, felt impacts shuddering through the airframe, heard the metallic shriek of rounds punching through aluminum. He couldn't evade. He couldn't fight back. His guns were damaged, the charging handles jammed, the ammunition feeds disrupted by the same burst that had nearly killed him. All he could do was hold the aircraft level and wait to die. Galland's first pass put 17 holes in Johnson's fuselage. The P-47 kept flying. Galland came around again. Another burst, another stream of 20mm and 7.92mm rounds hammering into the American fighter. Johnson counted impacts. 12, 15, more than he could track. A cannon shell exploded against his engine cowling. Another tore through his horizontal stabilizer. The aircraft shuddered like a living thing absorbing blows it should not have survived. The P-47 kept flying. Galland made a third pass, a fourth, a fifth. Each time, his guns hammered the American fighter with fire that should have been fatal. Each time, Johnson waited for the explosion, the fire, the sudden darkness that would end everything. Each time, the P-47 refused to die. Later, after he had somehow crossed the channel and crash-landed at Manston, after the medics had pulled him from a cockpit slicked with blood, after the maintenance crews had examined his aircraft with expressions that shifted from disbelief to something approaching awe, Johnson would learn what his aircraft had absorbed. 21 20mm cannon holes. Over 100 hits from 7.92mm machine guns. The fuselage looked like it had been attacked with an industrial hole punch. The hydraulic system was destroyed. The electrical system was severed in 4 places. The supercharger ducting had been punctured, reducing engine power by nearly half. The rudder was shredded. The elevator was hanging by a single hinge. One of the main fuel tanks had been holed by a round that somehow failed to ignite the aviation gasoline inside. Damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt. Damage that would have blown a Spitfire out of the sky. Damage that would have turned a Focke-Wulf into a falling torch. The P-47 had taken all of it, and Robert Johnson had flown it home. In his combat report that evening, still bandaged, still bleeding through the gauze, Johnson wrote a single sentence that captured what Kartveli had built. "The Jug is the toughest son of a bitch in the sky." Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland returned to his base with a claim for 1 P-47 destroyed. He had fired over 500 rounds into the American fighter. He had watched pieces of it fly off into the slipstream. He had seen damage that no aircraft could survive. The intelligence officer asked him to describe the victory. Galland hesitated. "I'm not certain it was a victory," he admitted. "The American crossed the channel. I followed him until my fuel ran low. He was still flying when I broke off." The intelligence officer stared at him. "You fired 500 rounds into a single aircraft and it escaped?" Galland nodded slowly. In his eyes was something his fellow pilots had not seen before. Not in a man with 17 victories, not in the brother of Adolf Galland himself. It looked, they would later recall, almost like doubt. "The aircraft," he began, then stopped, started again. "The aircraft should have gone down. It should not have been possible for it to continue flying. I don't understand what I saw." Word of Johnson's survival spread through the 8th Air Force within days. The photographs of his aircraft, that shattered, punctured, impossible ruin that had somehow carried a wounded pilot across the channel, became talismans, proof of something that defied the mathematics of aerial combat. The Germans had built fighters to kill quickly. The Americans had built a fighter that refused to die. And in that refusal, everything was about to change. The summer of 1943 became an education for pilots on both sides of the channel, though the lessons they learned were very different. American pilots learned to trust the dive. They climbed to altitudes German fighters could not efficiently reach, waited for their prey, and fell on them like hawks on sparrows. At 30,000 feet, where the turbo supercharger gave them full power and German engines gasped at 60%, they owned the sky. When FW-19s and BF-19s climbed to meet them, the P-47 simply dove away, accelerating through 400 miles per hour, then 450, then 500, speeds that German aircraft could not match without tearing themselves apart. German pilots learned something else. They learned fear. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke, a fighter pilot with JG-11 who kept a detailed diary throughout the war, recorded the transformation with the clinical precision of a doctor documenting a disease. July 14, 1943. Engaged American fighters over Hanover. The new tactics are troubling. They no longer try to turn with us. They dive through our formations at tremendous speed, firing as they pass, then run before we can respond. We cannot catch them in the dive. Our aircraft will not go as fast. We cannot catch them in the climb. They simply dive again if we pursue. The Thunderbolts are not better fighters than our 109s. They are fighting a different kind of war. August 3rd, 1943. Lost Feldwebel Kramer today. A P-47 came through our formation so fast I barely saw it. Perhaps 2 seconds of fire. Kramer's aircraft exploded. Not caught fire. Exploded, as if a bomb had detonated inside the fuselage. The American never slowed down. He was 3 kilometers away before I could turn to pursue. What are they putting in those guns? What they were putting in those guns was 8 streams of .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds, converging at 300 yards in a pattern roughly 2 meters wide. A 2-second burst put over 200 rounds into a space smaller than a German fighter's wingspan. The effect was not damage, it was disintegration. Gun camera footage recovered after the war documented the phenomenon with terrible clarity. Bf-10-9s hit by P-47s. Fire did not smoke, spiral, or glide toward the earth. They came apart. Wings separated from fuselages. Tails ripped free. Cockpits vanished in eruptions of glass and aluminum. Pilots died before they could reach for their canopy releases, killed by rounds that passed through engine blocks and firewalls and seat armor and flesh with equal indifference. Hauptmann Victor Bauer, the same officer who had laughed at reconnaissance photographs in April, encountered the reality of P-47 firepower on August 17, 1943, during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid. He had positioned his Staffel to intercept bombers over central Germany, climbing through scattered clouds toward a formation of B-17S that stretched across the sky like a silver carpet. He spotted the escort fighters at 28,000 feet. P-47s, perhaps 24 of them, orbiting above the bombers like patient vultures. "Ignore the fighters," he ordered his pilots. "They cannot follow us down. Attack the bombers." It was the standard tactic, proven effective for months. The heavy American fighters would not sacrifice altitude to pursue, and German pilots could make repeated passes at the bomber formation before fuel forced them to disengage. Bauer rolled into his attack dive, selecting a B-17 on the formation's edge. His wingman followed. Behind him, 8 more FW-190S began their runs, spreading across the bomber formation's rear quarter. The P-47s did not stay high. 4 Thunderbolts rolled inverted and pulled through, diving not toward Bauer, but toward the space he would occupy in 10 seconds. They were not chasing him. They were intercepting him, using their superior dive speed to cut angles he could not match. The geometry was new, precise, lethal. Bauer saw them coming too late. He pulled out of his attack run, abandoning his target, twisting into a defensive break that cost him 3,000 feet of altitude. His wingman was not as quick. The lead P-47 fired a burst that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Bauer saw the tracers converge on Unteroffizier Richter's aircraft from 400 yards, and the FW-190 came apart in midair, its fuselage separating just behind the cockpit, its pilot tumbling through space still strapped to his seat. 2 seconds. 1 burst. A veteran pilot and his aircraft reduced to falling debris. Bauer dove for the deck, weaving through cloud cover, his hands trembling on the stick. Behind him, he could hear fragments of radio traffic, pilots calling out contacts, calling for help, calling their own deaths in voices that cracked with disbelief. When he landed at Wevelgem an hour later, 3 of his 10 pilots were missing. That night, he amended his April diary entry with a single line: "I was wrong." The exchange rates told the story of what was happening. In April 1943, P-47 units had lost 31 aircraft while claiming 18 German fighters, a ratio of nearly 2-to-1 against the Americans. By August, the ratio had reversed. In August alone, P-47s claimed 53 German fighters, confirmed destroyed while losing 21 of their own. better than 2.5 to 1 in American favor. By October, the ratio exceeded 3 to 1. By December, it approached 4 to 1. And then came the doctrine that turned slaughter into annihilation. In January 1944, General James Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force and issued an order that shattered 50 years of fighter-pilot tradition. The escorts would no longer stay with the bombers. They would leave the formation. They would hunt. The mission of the fighters is to destroy the German Air Force, Doolittle told his commanders, not to protect the bombers. Destroy the enemy. On the ground if you can, in the air if you must, but destroy them. The P-47 was built for exactly this mission. It could dive on German airfields at 500 miles per hour, strafe parked aircraft and maintenance facilities with 8 guns that turned hangars into slaughterhouses, and use its speed to escape before flak gunners could react. It could catch German fighters during takeoff and landing, the moments when every aircraft was most vulnerable, and destroy them before they reached combat altitude. It could do things no fighter had ever done because it had been designed to do things no fighter had ever imagined. The Luftwaffe began to collapse. In January 1944, German fighter pilot losses exceeded 1,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. February was worse, 1,100. March was catastrophic, nearly 1,200. These were not replaceable losses. These were instructors, squadron leaders, men with hundreds of hours of combat experience who could not be replicated by training programs already stretched beyond capacity. Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful fighter pilots with 102 victories, was killed by a P-47 on March 2, 1944. Hauptmann Anton Haeckel, another ace, was shot down and badly wounded the same month. Hauptmann Josef Wurmheller, 102 victories, killed in June. Hauptmann Walter Nowotny, 258 victories, killed in November. The men who had laughed at the flying barrel were dying, one by one, to the aircraft they had mocked. And Victor Bauer, Hauptmann Victor Bauer, who had dismissed the P-47 as a flying truck and predicted significant American losses, was killed on December 13, 1944, over the Ardennes. The gun camera footage recovered from the American pilot who killed him showed a 2-second burst from directly astern. Bauer's FW-190 did not burn. It did not spiral. It came apart in midair, exactly as he had watched his own victims come apart, exactly as he had refused to believe was possible when he studied those first reconnaissance photographs in the spring of 1943. The flying barrel had found him. And in that 2-second burst, 19 months of mockery ended in falling debris over a frozen German forest. The ledger of what the P-47 achieved reads less like a combat record than an industrial catalog of annihilation. Between April 1943 and May 1945, P-47 Thunderbolts flew 546,000 combat sorties over Europe, more than any other American fighter. They dropped 132,000 tons of bombs and fired 135 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. They destroyed 11,874 enemy aircraft, 7,067 in the air, 4,807 on the ground. They destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 pieces of rolling stock, and 68,000 motor vehicles. They killed tens of thousands of German soldiers, airmen, and support personnel whose bodies were never counted and whose names were never recorded. The P-47 lost 5,222 aircraft to all causes: combat, accidents, mechanical failure. Against the nearly 12,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, this represented an exchange rate of better than 2 to 1 in the air alone. When ground kills were included, the ratio exceeded 3.5 to 1. But the numbers, vast as they were, captured only the physical destruction. They did not capture what the P-47 had done to the Luftwaffe's soul. Post-war interrogations revealed a German fighter force that had been psychologically broken long before the final surrender. Men who had entered the war believing in the superiority of German aircraft and German pilots, and who had been systematically disabused of both beliefs by an aircraft they had once dismissed as a joke. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, who had written the confident 1943 memorandum predicting the P-47's failure, was captured in May 1945 and subjected to extensive debriefing by American intelligence officers. His assessment of the Thunderbolt had evolved considerably. We made a critical error in evaluating the American fighter. We looked at weight, turn radius, climb rate, the metrics that had defined fighter performance since the First War. We concluded that the P-47 was inferior because it could not dogfight. We did not understand that the Americans had built an aircraft that did not need to dogfight. The P-47 changed the rules. It fought from altitudes we could not efficiently reach. It dove at speeds we could not match. It absorbed damage that would have destroyed any German fighter. And its guns... Galland paused here, the interrogation transcript noted, and shook his head. Its guns were not airplane weapons. They were artillery. A 2-second burst from a P-47 delivered more destructive energy than a full ammunition load from a Bf-109. Our pilots began calling it Der Zerstörer, the destroyer. The name was accurate. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, who had lectured pilots about American predictability in 1943, survived the war despite being badly burned in a takeoff accident in April 1945. Interrogated in a hospital bed, still bandaged, he offered a more personal assessment. I trained young pilots in early 1944. Boys, really, 18, 19 years old, with perhaps 80 hours of flight time. I told them what I had been told, that German aircraft were superior, that German tactics were superior, that if they followed doctrine, they would survive and triumph. I sent them against the Thunderbolts. They died. Most of them died within their first 5 missions. Not because they were poor pilots. They were adequate pilots, as good as our training could make them in the time we had. They died because everything I taught them was wrong. The Americans did not fight the way our doctrine predicted. They did not try to turn with us. They dove through our formations like wolves through sheep, firing those terrible guns, and they were gone before we could react. I stopped giving the lectures after a while. What was there to say? Go up and try not to die. The P-47 had made our doctrine obsolete. We had no replacement. We simply sent men up to be killed and pretended we still had an air force. Perhaps the most revealing testimony came from the pilots who had faced the P-47 in its element and lived to describe the experience. Feldwebel Horst Petschler, who flew Bf-109S with JG-53 through the final year of the war, was interviewed by American historians in 1946. You must understand what it was like to fight the Thunderbolt. From the ground before takeoff, you looked up and saw them circling at 8,000 meters, tiny specks in the blue, patient as vultures. You knew they were watching you. You knew that when you lifted off, they would come. The climb was the worst. A 109 climbs well, but slowly. It takes many minutes to reach combat altitude. The Americans had those minutes to select their targets. You would watch them roll over, one by one, and begin their dives. You never knew if you were the target until you saw the tracers. And if you saw the tracers, you were already dead. Not always. Sometimes you survived, sometimes they missed. But in your mind, the moment you saw those 8 streams of fire converging on your aircraft, you were dead. I saw pilots bail out of undamaged aircraft because Thunderbolts were diving on them. The fear was that complete. When one of them hit you, if you were lucky enough to survive being hit, the damage was incomprehensible. I landed once with 30 holes in my aircraft from a P-47 burst that lasted perhaps 1 second. 1 second. 30 holes. My wingman took a burst of similar length and his aircraft came apart around him. He fell 8,000 meters in a fuselage that no longer had wings. What kind of weapon does that in 1 second? The question echoed through interrogation transcripts, memoirs, and post-war interviews. German pilots returned to it again and again, struggling to articulate what they had witnessed, searching for language adequate to describe an aircraft that had violated everything they understood about air combat. General Major Dietrich Peltz, who commanded bomber and ground attack forces on the Western Front, summarized the Luftwaffe's institutional failure in a 1947 interview. We laughed at the P-47 when it first appeared. I remember the intelligence photographs, that absurd fuselage, those enormous dimensions. We called it names. We assumed it would fail. This was not stupidity. It was doctrine. Everything we knew about fighters told us that the P-47 should not work. But Alexander Kartveli did not design the P-47 to fit our doctrine. He designed it to destroy our doctrine, and that is precisely what it did. By the time we understood what we were facing, we had lost control of our own skies. The P-47 did not defeat the Luftwaffe alone. There were other factors, other aircraft, other pressures, but it was the P-47 that first taught us we were no longer masters of the air. It was the P-47 that broke our confidence. And once confidence is broken, everything else follows. Major Robert S. Johnson, the pilot who had survived Wilhelm Ferdinand Gallen's 500-round assault, ended the war with 27 confirmed victories, making him one of the top American aces in the European theater. All 27 kills were achieved flying the aircraft that German pilots had called the Eisenschwein, the Iron Pig, the Flying Barrel, the American Fatty. In a 1958 interview, Johnson was asked what he thought of the German mockery. He smiled. "They laughed at the jug," he said, "and then the jug killed them. That's the only answer that matters." In the spring of 1943, someone had drawn a cartoon on the mess hall chalkboard at Wevelgem Airfield, a P-47 so fat it required 2 runways to take off, its pilot a tiny stick figure dwarfed by the machine around him. Beneath the drawing, a caption read, "Der Amerikaner Dicke, the American Fatty." The chalkboard did not survive the war. The airfield did not survive the war. Most of the pilots who had laughed at the cartoon did not survive the war. Wevelgem was overrun by Allied ground forces in September 1944. American soldiers found the base cratered and abandoned, its hangars collapsed, its runways torn by bombs that P-47s had delivered. In the wreckage of the officers' quarters, an intelligence team recovered fragments of a diary belonging to a pilot whose name was redacted in the official report. One entry, dated November 1943, had been circled and underlined multiple times, as if the author had returned to it again and again. "The Thunderbolt is not what we believed. I have seen it absorb damage that would destroy 3 of our fighters. I have seen its guns tear aircraft apart in the time it takes to blink. I have seen our best pilots dive on it, hit it, watch pieces fly off, and watch it fly home regardless. We called it a flying barrel. We were right. But we did not understand what that meant. A barrel does not turn. A barrel does not climb. A barrel rolls downhill and crushes everything in its path, and nothing can stop it. And when it reaches the bottom, there is nothing left but splinters and silence. That is what the P-47 is. A barrel rolling downhill. And we are the splinters." Victor Bauer never read those words. By November 1943, he was still confident, still certain that German doctrine would prevail, still recording assessments in his precise handwriting that history would render grotesque. He had survived his August encounter with the new American tactics. He had lost wingmen, lost friends, lost the easy certainty that had characterized the spring, but he had not lost faith in the fundamental superiority of his aircraft and his training. That faith died over the Ardennes in December 1944, in a 2-second burst from an aircraft he never saw, fired by a pilot whose name was never recorded. The gun camera footage showed his FW-190 coming apart exactly as he had watched so many American aircraft come apart in the confident days of 1943, except that by December 1944, it was German aircraft that came apart, and American pilots who returned home to review the footage, and German families who received the telegrams. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not win the air war over Europe single-handedly. The P-51 Mustang flew farther. The P-38 Lightning carried heavier armament. British Spitfires and Hurricanes held the line when America was still at peace. The Soviet Air Force destroyed more German aircraft than any Western ally. But it was the P-47 that first broke the Luftwaffe's confidence. It was the P-47 that taught German pilots they could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. It was the P-47 that absorbed their fire, survived their attacks, and killed them in numbers that made victory impossible and mockery obscene. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian immigrant who had designed an aircraft that violated every principle his peers held sacred, lived until 1974. He never flew in combat. He never fired a shot in anger. He simply understood, with the clarity of an engineer who thought in systems rather than traditions, that the future of air warfare belonged not to the lightest aircraft or the most maneuverable, but to the one that could fly highest, dive fastest, hit hardest, and refuse to die when the enemy hit back. He had built exactly that aircraft, and 15,686 of them rolled off the assembly lines at Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, more than any other American fighter of the war. The Germans had built thoroughbreds, lean, fast, beautiful machines that embodied a century of European engineering philosophy. They had trained their pilots to fight as knights of the air, individual warriors whose skill would triumph over any numerical disadvantage. The Americans had built a barrel. They had filled it with 8 guns and an engine the size of a small car and enough armor to stop a cannon shell. They had taught their pilots to fight not as knights, but as mechanics of death. Diving, firing, extending, climbing, diving again, reducing air combat to a process rather than an art. The knights died. The mechanics won. In the archives of the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, among the thousands of documents that chronicle the Luftwaffe's rise and fall, there exists a single page of handwritten notes recovered from the personal effects of Hauptmann Victor Bauer. The page is undated, but historians believe it was written sometime in late 1944, in the final weeks of his life. Most of the page contains tactical observations, approach angles, fuel consumption rates, the mundane mathematics of a fighter pilot's war. But in the margin, in handwriting less precise than his usual script, Bauer had written a single sentence. It may have been a note to himself. It may have been the beginning of a letter never finished. It may have been an epitaph he sensed he would never have the chance to complete. The sentence read, "We laughed because we did not understand. Now we understand, and there is nothing left to laugh about. The American fatty, the iron pig, the flying barrel, the jug." They had laughed at it because it was fat, because it was heavy, because it could not turn, could not climb, could not do any of the things a fighter was supposed to do. But it could dive like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. It could pour 8 streams of .50 caliber fire into a target with the force of a cannon barrage. It could absorb punishment that would have vaporized any fighter the Germans built, then fly home for repairs and return the next day to kill again. The Germans had measured the P-47 by the standards of the past and found it wanting. The P-47 had measured the Germans by the standards of the future and found them dead.